Thank you, Denise. So happy to be here with all of you. Thank you so much. Excited to dive into this important conversation around women of color, allyship, and all the things. I welcome my panelists on this virtual stage with me. I'm really excited to dive into this. One thing that before we get started, we'll just do some quick bio. So I'll ask my panelists just to give us a little bit about themselves before we dive into a really hearty conversation. And if you have any questions during our talk, make sure that you put it in the chat so at the end we can get to those questions. And so, Kathryn, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Minda. Hi, everyone. And I'm just recognizing that my background is flipped. But hi, Kathryn Ross. I am a managing director with Accenture. I lead our global open innovation team, which is just a really long name that effectively means that I'm doing my best to connect our clients to the startup ecosystem. The second hat that I wear is I actually also lead our Black Founders Development Program. And very specifically, I'm looking at how do I connect with the underrepresented community from an investment standpoint, as well as a partnership and go-to-market standpoint.
Awesome, thank you. And Samara?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Samara Mejia Hernandez, and I'm a founding partner of Chingona Ventures. Chingona means badass woman in Spanish, and I invest in badass founders at the earliest stages. So I've launched last year. I've made 15 investments into companies all over the United States. 60% of my founders are women CEOs, 80% are minority CEOs. And my background is at Goldman Sachs in venture capital, and I'm also a Mexican immigrant to this country. So I grew up in a low income, dual language household, which I think provides a unique perspective on my investing style.
Great. And Tina?
Hi, everybody. So happy to be here this evening. Thank you for having me. My name is Tina Eskridge. I'm a senior marketing director at Microsoft. I currently lead all of our what's called marketing excellence, which is all of our digital marketing, analytics, marketing tech, and inclusion marketing for our Microsoft advertising division. I have spent my career mostly in marketing, but I also have a background in strategic operations. And I also am an active angel investor and advocate for D&I. So I'm really happy for this discussion.
Awesome. And last but not least, Kumbi.
Yeah, hi everyone. How are you all? Yeah, so my name's Kumbi Tinol. Yeah, you can hear from my accent. I was born and raised in the UK. I currently reside in Atlanta, and I'm the founder and CEO of a website called Urban Geeks, a news content site, which is an African American Latinx multicultural news platform focused on technology, business science, and entrepreneurship. Prior to moving stateside, I was a senior broadcast journalist for the BBC in London.
Great. Well, I'm excited to get into this conversation. What many of you may or may not know, when I wrote the book, The Memo, there are 5 major publishers. 4 of them said there was no audience for this book, and that this book would never do well, because when you have dominant majority at a table, they may not know and understand the experiences of women of color. And so it's so important that we have these intersectional conversations and we highlight not just women in the workplace, but we get very specific in terms of what women we're talking about. And one publisher did take a shot on me, and it became a best-selling book, and I'm working on 2 new books right now. And so let me tell you, allyship and all the things are important, and we're going to dive into it. But before we get into the meat of it, I have to ask each of you, what has been your experience as a woman of color in the workplace? And so we'll start with Kumbi this time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say my experience has been touch and go. If I'm really honest, there have been many points in my career, particularly when I was back in the UK, and I was working for a mainstream media brand, where I felt invisible, undervalued, and underestimated. And that's really the honest truth. I was, a young graduate, so obviously I was, getting my feet wet, but I didn't really feel supported in that environment. So it definitely, I've had some highs, but I've definitely had some lows in what I suppose is the equivalent of corporate America in the UK.
Thank you for that. And Tina, your experience?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Kumbi just said. I think that my experience has been, I've had some lows and I've had some highs. It's been mostly positive, but I can say, it hasn't been without its challenges at this point. And as I think about, in your book, Minda, you talk about this idea of moral injury. And when I read that, I was like, wow, I resonate with that completely, because, I oftentimes have ignored a lot of the trauma, that I've experienced in the workplace. And, for many of us as Black women, it goes, unspoken. And so I think that's something that I really identify with in terms of my experience, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, the trauma is real, right? and it sticks with us
It
sometimes
is.
when we don't, you know, take care of the internal part. Lauryn Hill said, "How you gonna win if you ain't right within?" And so it's gonna it's gonna take that work sometimes to
Yeah.
deal with that. Samara?
Yeah, I think similar to everyone else. I mean, being the first or one of the few women, Latina women in my engineering classes, in finance at Goldman Sachs and venture capital, I think it puts you in a unique position, but also a challenging position. The feedback that you get of being combative when you're being assertive, or not giving certain feedback to you because they think you're going to cry. I literally had a boss tell me that. Or getting bullied many times by a lot of, especially other women, has been challenging. But I think that all of this has made me stronger. And if you want to get me to do something, tell me I can't do it, and put me down. And that's just, again, it's the trauma, like everyone else said, which now my therapist says I should need to deal with it. But the way I deal with it is I'm productive and I get stronger and I build things and I would try to prove people wrong. And so while it's been obviously very tough, like everyone else, I think it's all made us a lot stronger, and it's forced us to think about what value, what unique perspective we bring. It's forced us to change, not the way we are, but maybe how we either react or how we communicate. And so overall, it's led us to where we are today, but it's definitely been extremely challenging.
Yep, absolutely. And Kathryn?
Yeah, I've got to reiterate, what the honorable panelists have shared. I've been doing this. I'm coming up on 27 years now, and it is true. Being the first, in some capacity seems like it's a win, but in other capacities, it's a significant challenge. And one of the traumas that has stuck with me for quite some time as a specific story is I remember. I was a senior executive within the firm. I'm in technology, have been delivering for clients for many years, leading not even one of my first, it's probably 10th, 12th senior executive meeting with a client. And we're all getting together in the room. The meeting hasn't started yet. I'm working with someone to get everything set up. And a client comes in and makes the assumption that I'm the secretary. And, so I didn't, the person who happened to be with me said, no, she's actually the one who's running this meeting. The problem turned out is that the person who made that comment was the senior person on the client side. And now, right, they are feeling very awkward and embarrassed for the mistake that they made. And I'm put in the position where I now have to figure out how to make them feel comfortable for their bias, if you will, coming in. So it put me in a trauma situation where first it's like you're leading this big meeting and it's like, number one, you're just hit with this, yet no, don't judge me based on that. But number two, now I've got to comfort the person, right, who made, and that's just the cycle, if you will, of what we have to do. Is not only do we have to deal with it, now we potentially have to comfort the other person, to get back to the meeting. So, those are the kinds of pressures that others, potentially don't feel as they move through this. So those are the kinds of challenges that, and I think to Samara's point, what I've done is I've surrounded myself with a network, with those sponsors, allies, mentors, where I could go vent, where I could, have the conversations necessary to make sure that I keep moving forward and moving to that next step.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing that, because it's real. And to Kathryn's last point, that some women might be sitting out there and saying, well, I'm not a woman of color, but I've experienced those things too. But there's certain things as women of color that only we experience in the workplace. And so yes, being oppressed as women in some of our workplaces is true, but there are hierarchies to the oppression, to the trauma. And so we have to understand those unique challenges. The next question I have is, there's always a risk associated with speaking truth to power. I'd love to hear from all of you. Can you share some of the challenges you face when practicing that? And I know with writing the memo, I was really afraid to put it out into the atmosphere because I did speak truth to power in my experience. And I can't speak for every woman of color or every Black woman, but speaking your truth is a sense of freedom too, but there can be a cost associated with that. Tina, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. I think, when I think about speaking truth to power and, what are some of the challenges, the most immediate challenge I think we face as Black women, not having the advocacy that we need in many corporate spaces, is that, the most obvious, will we be jeopardizing our jobs or even our careers, right? I think that at the end of the day, there's so many instances in which, we are placed unfairly in some of these environments. And, we don't always have the latitude to lean in the way our white colleagues can do. And it's really, it's hard. It's just very hard.
Samara?
Yeah, it's interesting because growing up, my mom was, we're immigrants, and she didn't speak English, and she would get a lot of stuff at work, and she'd come home crying, and she's like, I'm working this job and I can't speak up because I'm going to get fired and I can't say anything, but I'm working so that you don't have to do that. And that always stuck with me. For better or for worse, I've always been speaking up. And of course, you as a woman, but also if you're a woman of color, or Latina woman, in my case, it's seen very, very differently. And one example of this is when I wrote an article talking about the lack of diversity in venture capital and tech back in 2016. The title was "Why Your Boss is Still a White Guy." Now, I know the title is provocative, but it got your attention, and it showed by numbers and by research exactly what was happening in the space and very tactical ideas on what to do to change that. And I got, within 24 hours of posting it, I got so much pushback, and people started coming out and saying things about my appearance, calling me a communist, calling me racist, all the things that you could possibly think of. And my co-author was a white man, and no one said one word to him. And we wrote the same article. So for me, after that, it was so hard to try to speak up again. And I finally got my voice again. I was like, F that. I don't really care what anybody thinks. This is the truth. I'm speaking the truth. And I realized there are some consequences to that. But for every negative comment I got 10 positive comments from women all over the world saying how they have been in tech for 30 years and they've experienced all of what I was talking about, or how it hasn't changed. And people will either love you or they're going to hate you, but you have to be authentic to yourself. And for me, that's what I've learned. And that's what I do. I say it how it is. And sometimes people love it, sometimes people hate it, but you know what? I've taken a stance, and that's the only way we're going to make a change going forward.
Absolutely. And thank you for your courage. I know it takes a lot of courage for us to lean into some of these conversations that are tough, but so many people benefit from them when we lean into that courage. So thank you for that. Kumbi?
Yeah, I was going to say it's so important just to move forward confidently. I mean, it's difficult, as a woman of color, and often people underestimate you in the workforce, even as in myself, obviously at the helm of a tech startup. So, often, even when you go into meetings, sometimes you see people just don't take you seriously. But it's just so important just for your mental health to actually really stand up for yourself. So just one incident that I remember when I was pregnant back in the UK working for, a big media brand, I was getting a lot of, I had an editor who was consistently I was visibly pregnant, I think it was about 5 months, just, really giving me a hard time, probably bordering on bullying actually. And I remember, I think I just got to that point, I'm just like, you know what, next time this guy comes for me, I'm going to stand up for myself. And we actually end up having a very heated discussion in the middle of the newsroom. We weren't shouting, but it was a heated discussion. And he asked me to go home. I think it got to the point that he was actually quite embarrassed that he was arguing with a pregnant woman. And I just said, no, I'm not going to go home. And, he was like, you need to go home. I said, I'm not going to go home. And even though it was a very uncomfortable situation, I tell you, I always look back and say, I'm so happy I didn't leave. And I felt so empowered at that point. And actually, a lot of women came up to me afterwards and said, kind of whispered in my ear that they, we've been seeing what's been going on, and they really admire the fact that I actually stood my ground. So it is important, because sometimes when you don't, you look back and you regret when you don't stand up for yourself at really key moments in your career. So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. That's a really great point, because I know there's been times in my career where you're like, man, I should have said something, and then it plays on a loop in your head, right? Like, I should have said it. And but thank you for your courage in that moment, Kathryn.
Yeah, you know what? There are the big conversations, the big moments that can be just mentioned. Those points where it's time to take a stand and have those conversations, and who's on the other end and what's their receptivity to it. And these are all the things that are going through your head, right? In terms of having it. So it's not even just having the conversation, there's everything else around it, around what are you going to say, who's that person, who else is around, and everything else that adds a lot of pressure to it. What I would say as well is, probably the times are a little bit different now. I would say that race and racism is the conversation is happening within corporate America today, probably more than it ever has before. But where I would go back and maybe point to, so not to say that it's easier, but at least it's happening more right now. But it's in the small moments. It's in the moments where you're not prepared, right? Where bias comes to you. Because if a conversation's coming, you can prepare for it. What are the points? What do I want to make and make happen? But it's those moments where you're standing in the airport and someone asks you why you're standing in the first class line, right? The times where you are not prepared, right, to have a conversation, where you have to sort of take a step back. And I know that, personally for myself, there are some times where I'm like, I am too tired to have a teaching moment with this person. But then there are other times where you say, let me just ask you why you're asking only me, right? And not everybody else around. And so that's where I think the opportunity lies in terms of speaking your truth to power, is understanding the moment, that every moment is a teaching moment. And even in the times where you're not prepared for it, to still sort of come in, maybe pre-prepped, that these things happen in the marketplace. And, how do you want to react? I think to the point exactly that you made, Minda, where you don't regret not having said something. You don't have it on a loop in the back of your head. It's, every given point, you do have that moment where you say something to someone, you pause and you react, because it's going to happen to the next person. So I think for me, there are the big moments and I'm prepared for those. It's just, how do I make sure that in the small moments, the ones where I'm not prepared for it, that I still, put myself in that position where I'm prepared to respond.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I think that's so important and key to remind ourselves that we have more of the small moments, right? Or the subtle moments that happen on the Zoom call, on the Google Hangout, in those moments.
Right. Think about the moment where someone says to you, oh, wow, you speak so articulately, as opposed to what, right? It's those kind of moments where you've got to make sure that you respond.
Absolutely. The next question, I want to kind of pivot just a little bit, and we'll start with Samara. What is corporate America, the tech industry, getting right when it comes to the advancement of women of color?
Yeah, particularly in tech, because I've been out of big corporate for, I think, about 7 years now. So I'll talk about it from the tech perspective and the venture capital perspective. The first, it was the Me Too movement, and there was a lot of conversation around women. And I will say that many times women of color got left out of that conversation. So that happened for a few years. And more recently, a lot more conversations have been about race, to Kathryn's point. And I think those have been overall positive. I think it's forced conversations, and very uncomfortable conversations from people. It's actually forced conversations on the other side, of people actually being honest about how they actually feel about race, and about how they actually feel about certain things. Like, for example, I'm in a Slack group with a bunch of fund managers, and my fund got an investment from PayPal Ventures, and of course I'm super excited for it. They invested in Black and Latino funds. There was 8 of us, and I was super excited, and everyone kind of said congrats. And then there was a discussion around from both men and women that were not of color that were just saying, well, I'm working just as hard, or, well, is diversity not women anymore? And so and I was so uncomfortable. I was the only one in the room, right? I was just like, oh my gosh, this is so uncomfortable. And so, but at the same time, I appreciated that they felt comfortable saying that, because I think in the past, it was just something you didn't bring up and they would maybe say it behind your back. Whereas now we're having that. And finally, I had one of those moments where I wasn't going to say anything. And then one of my friends just jumped in and said something on my behalf. And I was like, you know what, guys, I worked my butt off for this, right? I'm not new to venture, and this, and this is why I believe I got that investment. And it will ultimately go into these founders and, X, Y, and Z. And they, I think they appreciated that conversation too. So I think what we're getting right is not only having the conversation, but also having people speak their truth about it. And that's, I think, a learning moment for all of us. I'm like, okay, I really know how you feel. And on the other end, I can kind of push back and speak for us. So I think that's what we're getting right.
Awesome. Kathryn, what are you seeing that we're getting right?
You know what? I see, first and foremost, that organizations are recognizing that they actually have talent within their organization. I think prior to this, I kept hearing we can't find diverse talent. And I just give people the strength. I can point to 3 people in your organization alone who could do that job. They just need this, right? Exposure. They need a little bit of training. They need these things, but they're not seeing it for a variety of different reasons, bias, or otherwise. So I think some of those blinders, if you will, are starting to come off. Maybe not as fast as we like, but hey, they're coming off. To Samara's point, we're having a conversation that we were not having before. Race was, you didn't talk about age, sex, or politics. Race wasn't even on the list, right? Now it's something that is being talked about within organizations. And I think, once again, having that conversation first and foremost is incumbent in order for us to change. Because if people do not understand the experience, they don't understand the baggage, if you will, that diverse people are coming in and working under, then nothing will change. So I think we're in the early stages. I mean, diversity and inclusion has been around for 20 plus years. We're at an inflection point. And now is, I think, the opportunity to utilize this inflection point to sort of drive things forward. So I think it starts with corporate. I like the fact that many of them, my company included, are being transparent. Here's what our numbers are. Here's where we want to get them to, right? And hold us accountable for doing that. So I think those are the kinds of new optics and new drivers that will change, change the game for women.
Yeah, absolutely. Tina, what are you seeing?
I agree with both Samara and Kathryn. I think, ultimately, I forget the old saying, it's something like you measure what matters. And, in most of our business environments, things haven't been measured. D&I was not something that was always measured, and seeing it, being measured is super, super critical. And I think it's the right path. The other thing is tying D&I indicators to key performance metrics, right? Making sure that, there is some consequence, or at least some sort of incentive for people to focus on D&I. And that's something that's been happening more and more. And then the third thing for me that I'm seeing, that I think that most tech companies are starting to get right, is actually focusing on D&I across all aspects, not just from a hiring perspective. And, I say this as someone who focuses on inclusion marketing and inclusion product design. Like, that is something that's super critical, because we have to see ourselves not just in the company as producers, but we also need to see ourselves in our marketing, in the marketing that the company is doing, in the product. How is the product made to accommodate the diversity of the population? And so I think that's really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Kumbi?
Yeah, absolutely agree with what everyone says, particularly the fact that, at least at this point now, that there's an acknowledgement that there is a problem. And I know, say 10, 15 years ago, that conversation was not the forefront. And the other big thing for me is really data and metrics. And I always say this because I remember I was pretty aware of this when this was going on. And I don't think he gets enough credit, but Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Foundation, and this is more specifically in the tech industry, it was that organization that were really pushing the big tech companies to actually publish their employer demographics. And that's really that was a momentum behind Facebook and all the sort of big tech companies. Us actually seeing, oh my God, 2% of, Black people are, employed in these jobs. So I think that for me, that's a really big, that's been a really big turning point. Companies being forced to be transparent with their data. And that for me is something that's definitely, moving things forward. So without a doubt, employer demographics, that data now being in the open, and it wasn't in the open before.
Yep, absolutely. And the data tells us a lot of the story, right? So now we can have our feelings about the situation, but we also have the data to back those things up. So I'm glad that we have that. The next thing I think is important, and if you have questions, please make sure that you get those into the box so that we'll have time to get to your questions. But I want to shift into allyship, because I think allyship, we've been talking, it's kind of a buzzword. For me, if you read the memo, I really hate the word ally, but because we all understand the basic definition of it, it works for what we're talking about, because I think a lot of people are calling themselves allies without actually having any receipts, right? Not actually doing anything to earn that badge. And so I'd love for us to talk about, how can someone be an active ally, and what does active allyship look like? Tina, do you want to start?
Sure. Oh, that's such a great question. I have a diverse reaction to the word ally as well, because ultimately I think no one can call themselves an ally. You can be an aspiring one at best, but I think that in order to become an active ally, you certainly have to leverage your power or your privilege in places in that those that are underrepresented can't go, right? If it's in the boardroom, in that meeting, speaking up for somebody, the key word or the opportune word in allyship is active, like actively helping people who are underrepresented. How are you being active in that? How are you engaging? Many people think it's enough to just say I'm an ally, and that is absolutely not true. The other thing is acknowledging that there is an imbalance somewhere. There are so many instances where we as women of color are told that we're just imagining things, right? And so a true ally has to be able to actually see the circumstance as it is, so that they can engage and they can put forth use their privilege for power in those situations where we can't.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point. I teach at NYU, and we are talking about courageous conversations. And I said, if somebody has enough courage to come and tell you that they're being micro or macro aggressed, hear them out, right? Being an ally is hearing them out, hear what they have to say. That's part of it, right? Kumbi?
Yeah, this is a little bit broad, but I definitely think I just want to highlight this point that I remember reading somewhere about an actor, I think like an A-lister, that only would take a job, a sort of big acting gig if his female co-star was paid the same as him. And for me, that's true allyship, because I think a lot of allyship really goes down to the economics. I mean, it's all about the money, or at least in part. So for me, that's true allyship. Someone putting their neck out there, saying that, putting their money where their mouth is, saying that they will not take this job unless their co-star, their female co-star, actually gets paid the same as them. For me, that's true allyship.
That's really active, isn't it?
Really,
That's active for real. We need those. Kathryn?
Yeah, no, I mean that hits it, sort of right there. I guess I'll give another story. I mean, the two things that when you say allyship, to me that comes to mind are, one, curiosity, and two, action. Right? Curiosity, you want to know the other person's experience. You want to have the opportunity to understand what it means to be in their shoes. I will say that, with the events of this past summer, with Black Lives Matters and everything else, I had a slew of both colleagues, clients, external folks reaching out to ask me how I was. And thank you to all of them for doing that. But part of the conversation I had with them was, how many of you have a person of color who sits at your table? And I don't mean your corporate table, right? Where you go to work, at your dinner table with your family, right? Because if all you do is you go to work and that's where you interact with a diverse community, but then you come home and what you're surrounded with is a non-diverse community, then there's a disconnect, right? Because these are human beings, they're people, not to say that you don't go to dinner with them, but you're having dinner with them as part of your family. It brings humanity sort of into the picture. So that, I think, for me, from an allyship is truly gets to the heart of that curiosity, that you want to understand truly what it means to be in that other person's shoes. And that becomes a part of your existence. Because if it does, then to what Kunbi just says, you won't go into a meeting or something else where you allow someone else, anyone else, to be treated as less than. And I think that's, ultimately what allyship is about.
Absolutely. Samara?
Yeah, I'm going to say a quote from my friend Monique, but she says, minorities are often over-mentored and underinvested, right? And that is so true in so many levels. And there's the quote of, stop mentoring and start making the hire and sending the wire. So it all goes back down to creating real opportunity for someone. And I typically use the word sponsorship, not ally or mentor or whatever word you want to use. I think of a sponsor as someone that will actually fight for you in the boardroom, will fight for you to get you the promotion, to get you that check, to get you in a deal that you would not have normally gone into. And I'm seeing a lot more allies come in, but not the traditional ally, right? Because there's a lot of PR, there's a lot of that stuff, there's a lot of fluff. But there are more people being very intentional that are not on Twitter, that are not in the media, and just behind closed doors. I have like a few angels out there that are just, I know that it was them that sent somebody to me that is, for an investment or for a check into my fund or for something else. And I'm grateful for that. And I think we just need more of that, especially for women of color. We get less than 1% of all venture capital, less than 1% of all funds are run by women of color. And so we, especially more than any other time, need that now.
Absolutely. I mean, we need allyship, we need sponsorships, we need all the ships sailing our way because it's very important that we have that. And because we're, at the festival here, it's important to note that women should be other allies for each other, right? We can't just look to men to be the sponsors. If you have a sphere of influence, let's use it for each other. And also too, the memo is a great resource. If you want to be an ally, read, listen, educate, activate. That will really help you as you're thinking through some things. The last question that I have for all of you, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I know that we could have it all day long, so many stories to be told. But again, if you have any questions, please pop that in. I am a lover of grits and rap lyrics, and in the book, The Memo, I lace it with a lot of different songs that help me get through those traumatic times in the workplace, that we just need our song, from Beyonce songs to Drake to Jay-Z. And I just want to know, ending on a really high note, what would you say is your anthem when you just need to like turn it up and it gets you amped up? Kunbi, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, definitely has to be Beyonce's Run the World Girls. I love that song. And actually, one of the reasons I love it is because it just really, reflects how strong women are. We are so strong. We carry babies, we juggle work, we juggle our homes. We just do so much in the face, often, in adversity. So absolutely, Beyonce's Run the World Girls is definitely my favorite anthem.
Love it, love it. Kathryn?
All right, well, Kunbi just took my first choice, but what I'll do is I will date myself, a product of my times, and one that has stuck with me and I still remember from my college days, and it's Janet Jackson and it's Rhythm Nation. And there's a phrase in there where it says, fighting for a better way of life. So that's what sort of plays in my background when, I'm hitting it hard, trying to figure out what the next step is.
I'm seeing Janet doing her moves in that video. I love it.
There you go. I feel formation came from that.
Samara.
So I have, the usual ones, I think, like the women empowering ones, but the one that I immediately thought of was Jay-Z, Ain't No Love. And the reason why is because my boss at Goldman, I remember I was having trouble on the desk and I was getting bullied by someone, by, all sorts of things. And he brought up that song. I was like, what? He's like, have you listened to the lyrics? I'm like, no. And there's so much in there. Like every other line is just about trying to be successful. And a lot of people sometimes will help you, many times they won't. And you just kind of have to look past them. If there's a line that says, I'm not looking at you dudes, I'm looking past you. And it's just one of those where I just get amped up. And again, it's like when we go through all these struggles, for me, I just get more productive. I get more motivated. And so that's the song I listen to many times when I'm weightlifting or going for a run.
I love that. Jay-Z always has some really good nuggets of wisdom in his songs. Tina?
That's a very tough question. I'm like you, I'm a huge music buff. I would say the song that I have been listening to as of late is Ladders by Mac Miller. And basically the chorus is like somehow we got to find a way. And I think that speaks to, just our resilience in corporate America. Like we find a way, particularly as women of color, we always find a way. And I would say, if I think about in your book, then the quote that resonated with me, or the song, it was the Kendrick Lamar quote, I got loyalty and royalty inside my DNA. That's something that's been instilled in me from my family, and I hope everyone else carries that as well.
Yes, all great anthems. So if you need to keep pumped up after the festival, get you a playlist going, add these songs to it, all good stuff. We have time for a couple quick questions, and I'll just throw it out there, and whoever wants to chime in, we have about 5 minutes left. How do you pitch to a VC when they are unfamiliar with Latina culture? Maybe Samara, do you want to?
Yeah. Well, try to find, right, it's hard to try to find a Latina in VC because there's like the decision-making Latinas, there's 15 of them, and I know like all of them. So I actually always advise people to talk about your business. Obviously, if you find a Latina, they'll get it right away and you guys can dig into that. But make it broader, right? And think about it as an investable opportunity. And sometimes people won't even use a specific cultural reference, or what they'll do is they'll just basically focus on the data and the traction. So I'll give you an example. There was one woman that it was a fertility company that it's for fertility tracking, and basically because it's all women, you insert it and it tests your environment, and so it'll give you predict better results on your fertility. And she started going into the data and the AI and the ML and the opportunity and the traction and the numbers, and I was like, that's amazing. Tell me about how it works. Go into the specifics. Tell me all the stuff because I'm interested too, And she's like, I'm sorry, I just never, I can't even talk about it because guys get queasy. And she just knew she got all funding from all men, but she knew how to speak to them as an investable opportunity first and foremost, without getting into like the nuances necessarily on the women's stuff that it's obviously at the core of her business. So that's how I think about it. And then I would also think about it more broader, not just the Latino community, although it's the fastest growing community in the United States with the most purchasing power, which is nuts. Why people still think it's like a niche opportunity. But I would position it as either more broader, or how it can get into other industries or other markets. Or if you have traction, focus on the traction, and no one can deny, right, that people are actually buying it in real revenue.
Thank you for that. We have time for one more question here. It says, I should be having my glasses on. It's so small in the Q&A. What would you advise when you are mistreated or receive microaggressions on a daily basis? And they put in an example of being volunteered for things that nobody else wants to do, or keeping information from you. Does anybody want to jump in on the microaggressions?
Just one thing I'll say quickly, and some of you may disagree with me, but I do believe you need to stay where you're valued. If it gets to a point in a job where you're under so much pressure on a daily basis and you're not being valued and you're getting bullied on so many different levels, there comes to a point where you actually just need to leave.
Go where, yep. Go where you can grow. I love that.
Absolutely. Go where you can grow. And here's my thought always is surround yourself with a network. I always want to get a whole bunch of people in the boat with me so that we're rowing together towards the shore. If I have a lead, I always find out who their boss is and I start creating a relationship with them, right? Or influencers of them, right? So know who you're working for, know the person who is doing those microaggressions and find out who their cadre, their coterie, whatever it is. Now, not everyone's they may have the same mindset, etc. But generally, especially in corporate America these days, you're gonna find somebody, 1, 2, 3 who aren't. And here's what I would potentially suggest as an opportunity. Number one, so what can be said, if this is not the environment, please, right? It may be time to leave. But if there's a possibility there, take the work that they give you, do it to a really, really good, an excellent capacity, and then send an email to them and their boss and these people and say, hey, thank you so much for this opportunity. I was able to do this and drive this and to build this business. Now you have taken something that was not loved or wanted by anyone else. You've done a fantastic job and you've let a whole bunch of other people know about your ability to be excellent.
Great. Tina, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Cumby. She took the words right out of my mouth in terms of like, and you have to go where you're valued. But more importantly, I understand that there's a lot of privilege in that advice because there's some people that can't afford to just walk away from a job. So, finding advocates, finding sponsorship within that environment is really, really important. People that will be willing to step up and speak up when you are being microaggressed against is really, really key. So make sure that you take somebody into those meetings or you identify somebody in those meetings that you can have if you trust them enough to have a personal conversation with them, sit down with them and tell them what you're experiencing. And hopefully if you can find that person, they will then step in those meetings so you don't just have to advocate for yourself.
Great advice. Again, I just want to thank you all for being part of such a great conversation, and let's all keep securing our seat at the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.